Okay, didn't get quite as far as I hoped, perhaps in discussing Williams on foundationalist and coherentist theories of justification at our Zoom class yesterday. That's okay. I enjoyed the class. I'm glad we could make a time to meet. I barely got through maybe the definition of foundationalism, I suppose. But I think, one thing that is quite interesting about Williams's book, in one way it's a textbook, just introducing basic themes and figures in epistemology. But it's also an opinionated treatise on epistemology. And Williams has interesting criticisms of both foundationalism and coherentism. I think criticisms that he regards as totally destructive, actually, though they might be revivable, in various ways. Rarely is a theory in philosophy just straight up dead, especially one as venerable as foundationalism or coherentism, I guess. All right. Just to repeat, the way he characterizes foundationalism, substantive foundationalism, he has a sort of a characterization of the structure of foundationalism, the abstract structure of foundationalisms, various versions of foundationalism, in which linear chains of justification, you can find out more about what that means here, terminate in epistemically basic beliefs. All right. Often the immediate contents of one's own consciousness, if any. All right. Again, one possible version of this is that I can be wrong about whether this thing is red. That's an interesting color problem right there, isn't it? But I can't be wrong that I seem to see something red. So we peer out at the world through our own seemings. Right? It's probably true that I have a little difficult time containing my hostility to this kind of view, which I've spent much of my career attacking. But at any rate, so sense data theory underlies that. And you get different versions of foundationalism. For one thing, according to what status the foundationalism in question attributes to basic beliefs. Okay, so you could give the very strongest epistemic status, that is that basic beliefs are, maybe beliefs about my own sensations, are indubitable. They cannot be false if I think they're true. Right? People have had to retreat from that one by and large. Okay. Or they're incorrigible. They're unrevisable in some way, even if that's not the same thing as to say they're true exactly or necessarily true. All right, but or you could say that the basic beliefs are prima facie justified. That is, in the absence of some obvious defeater, they're justified. You could say that they're provisionally justified, and hold that that's good enough to give a foundation of knowledge or to yield a structure of belief that is adequately justified, at least for some bits of it to count as knowledge. So that's, the idea that you have, that the the basic beliefs in the foundational structure don't have an indubitable status, but have a, prima facie plausible status, at least. That yields a range of possible positions in foundationalism, from very strong to very modest. All right, so that's kind of a taxonomy of foundationalism. I did assign on the syllabus readings from Humour's anthology by Lawrence Bonjour and William Alston. And Bonjour's, the reading from Bonjour is really a classic statement of coherence theory of justification. Really basically maybe the first in the 20th century, or in the late 20th century. The first by a serious analytic philosopher, as opposed to maybe a German idealist or someone with pragmatist leanings. All right, and the William Alston puts forward. It's quite complex, but a modest foundationalism. All right, I guess I'm going to leave those basically as background. It seems like Williams should be background. But I guess I'm working through the Williams, and then we're going to go on to more, I think, and the proof of the external world. All right. Now, here's Williams, in the course of discussing foundationalism, there's many interesting moments in his discussion. For one thing, he explores the analytic, synthetic, a priori, a posteriori, contingent, necessary distinctions. Well worth looking into, and relevant to epistemology, at least as in many ways. Okay, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to all that. The objection he brings to foundationalism, particularly the versions of foundationalism that end chains of justification at sense data or immediate contents of consciousness or seemings, how things seem to me. His objection is that if you formulate if you use, what is it that justifies the claim, for example, that the apple is red? All right. Is it your sheer sensation of redness? Or is it your belief, that you're having a red sensation or something like that? Okay. Williams argues that only a belief can justify a belief. Only a proposition can enter into a inferential relation, whether inductive or deductive or abductive, etc., with another proposition. And we're discussing knowledge as supervening on belief as a propositional attitude. Knowledge involves belief, attitudes toward propositions. Okay. Possibly from the belief that I see something red, I can infer under decent conditions that there is something red. All right. Or from the belief that I'm having a red sensation. I just want to note that that's not the kind of thing one usually does believe at all. Anyway, I'm having a red sensation as I look at the blood orange. From the belief I'm having a red sensation, I infer that there is something red. Okay, along with a bunch of other conditions like that I'm not, insane, that the light is reasonably good, I have a pretty good open view of the blood orange, etc. All right. So, but justification is a cognitive relation. It's an inferential relation among propositions, where it involves that necessarily, according to Williams. So the sheer sensation or the red patch in my visual field, if any, is not itself, can't itself constitute a justification for my belief that there's a red thing in the world. Right? The sheer sensation cannot. Only the belief or the proposition, for example, that I'm seeing, that it seems to me that I'm seeing something red. All right. So the relation is from basic beliefs to, an expanded version of empirical knowledge, that goes beyond those basic beliefs. Not from sheer sensations. All right, let me see if I can, I'll give you Williams' statement of this. So this is on page 97 of Problems of Knowledge by Michael Williams. This approach to the foundations of knowledge is fraught with difficulties, the approach I've been describing about of foundationalism with basic beliefs. One problem stands out immediately. How could merely having experiences or sensing sense data justify anything? However basic knowledge is understood, basic knowledge, the foundational level of knowledge, it must be capable of standing in logical relations. It must be capable of standing in logical relations to whatever judgments rest on it. But this means that even basic knowledge must involve propositional content, and so cannot consist in a mere relation to a particular, such as a red patch in my visual field. Sensing a sense datum is no more knowing anything than is standing next to a lamppost. For this reason, some philosophers reject the idea that experience, if experience is sharply distinguished from judging or believing, can justify anything. And he says that the content of experience, if it is to have any epistemological significance, must be propositional in form. This amounts to rejecting any sharp distinction between experiencing and judging or believing. And, he works this distinction, of sort of famous distinction in 20th century philosophy from Bertrand Russell, knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. Okay, like the immediate acquaintance with the given versus reconstruction into propositions. And Williams is just simply denying that sheer experience can amount to knowledge. Knowledge, as we're discussing it, is a propositional matter. It requires like a linguistic redescription of the immediate experience to serve at, epistemically at all. All right. I'm not sure this is Williams' original problem. I mean, I think it's a pretty traditional objection to foundationalism, but he's really sharp on it. He says this on 98. Acquaintance with sense data is supposed to be a form of non-propositional knowledge. Acquaintance with sense data is supposed to be a form of non-propositional knowledge. This is what I claim we cannot understand, how something can be non-propositional and yet knowledge. Knowledge provides evidence, grounds for further inferences, but only that which can be true or false, thus propositionally contentful, can confirm or refute. All right. That appears plausible, but I want to quickly suggest a kind of ordinary language answer to it. Would we say, for example, that only propositions can serve as evidence of propositions? If I say that the bloody footprints are evidence, that the killer left by the back window, all right. The bloody footprints are not a proposition, are they? But there's certainly evidence that the killer left by the back window, okay? DNA. DNA is not a proposition, but DNA in 1,000 different permutations is evidence for the truth and falsity of propositions. I don't see the motivation of saying that experiences can't constitute evidence and things like that. Actually, that seems wacky to me. Williams himself says something like, this might appear to be too intellectualist. I'll say, okay, so, actually it draws you to a coherence point of view, because it appears that justificatory activities never eventuate in anything non-propositional. It's just like more words churning in the idiolect, I guess. Right? And that would violate various constraints that Williams himself regards as plausible, that there has to be external input into the knowledge system on any plausible theory of justification, he says. Right? Bonjour, in his coherence theory, says exactly the same thing. Like there has to be external constraint on the system of knowledge, even in a coherence conception. And I just want to share my view, I guess, that for both Bonjour and Williams, these are ad hoc constraints. They're just like ways to pretend to be realists by just stipulating that there has to be input from an external world as a condition of adequacy for a theory, with no actual argument for that. Because it's really true that all these very intellectualist conceptions where you're just exchanging words for words and propositions, working in a map of propositions, don't seem to have any place for an actual universe. Don't seem to even acknowledge that we're organisms on the surface of a planet, okay? To say it's overly intellectualistic is putting it mildly. All right, let's talk about coherence for a second. And if you really want to see the coherence theory that Williams reconstructs, the selections from Bonjour in the humor book are worthwhile. All right. So the first thing that Williams uses to one thing I want to say, just before I hit that, is if you want to see a beautiful little refutation of phenomenalism. This takes us a little farther afield, but the idea that external objects are constructions out of sense data. It's an old position. Check out page 109, where Williams completely destroys that, I guess. Okay, on a very nice sort of coherentist basis, actually. All right, I'm just mentioning that, drawing your attention to a passage that we're going to, or a whole chapter that we're not really going to be able to grapple with. So again, in chapter 10, Williams is discussing the coherence theory, and basically the version of coherence that he works with is Bonjour's, for very good reasons. It's the most developed and the most careful version of coherence theory, and the most plausible I know of anyway. And one thing he talks about is the immediate move of coherence theory. All right, so again, we're in the space of Agrippa's trilemma. And here's the solution where supposedly, one of the problems, one of the horns of the trilemma is that the justification of a certain belief eventually, is, P is justified by Q, Q is justified by R, and eventually R or S or T is justified by P again. Okay. So, one solution to the trilemma is just saying, it circles around. I mean, that's the problem, a problem. Okay, one of the three possible problems that arise. Now, that supposes that the justification of a given P is a straight line, like, it's linear in Williams's parlance, that there is a Q or a argument consisting of Q, R, and S that directly justifies P. So there's a line of, like an inferential or evidential line from each, purported piece of knowledge, in the case of foundationalism, down by a linear progress to the foundational level of knowledge. All right. And the Agrippa's trilemma problem, where you're just going in a circle, that, if coherence did that, if a coherence theory did that, it would obviously be inadequate. Okay, you can't justify something in virtue of itself, right? Or everything would be justified. Right? Everything is justified. Every assertion is justified in virtue of itself, if anything is justifiable in virtue of itself. If P, then P, in every case. All right. So if P can be a reason to believe P, then every P is justified. All right. Okay, so Bonjour says that we've got to, reconceive belief in terms of a web, a network, a structure in which each proposition is related to many propositions and justified by those relations. A coherence among a explanatory coherence among a whole network of belief, rather than a linear progress of inferring one proposition after another, let's say. Okay, so he says this. Whereas, this is right at the end, chapter 10 on page 117, whereas foundationalist theories of justification are atomistic, coherence theories are holistic. For the coherence theorist, there is not a question of a belief being justified all by itself, except maybe in some derivative sense, as the foundationalist beliefs are supposed to be. To be justified on a coherence account, a belief must fit into a justified system. It's the system primarily, not a single belief that is justified. The system is more or less justified depending on how well it hangs together, its coherence, considered as a whole. This reference to whole systems is crucial. Coherence theories do not claim merely that the epistemic significance of a given belief must always be assessed in the context of some further commitments. Rather, they insist that the justification of individual beliefs depends on certain properties of total belief systems. Coherence theories are radically holistic in that sense. The difference between foundationalism and coherence theory is sometimes explained in terms of two competing models of justifying inference. This is Bonjour, he's recapitulating here. The foundationalist conceives justifying inference on a linear model in which justification proceeds from given premises to conclusions by justification transmitting rules. The coherence theory's holistic model of justification is decidedly nonlinear. While the beliefs that comprise a given system will be logically interconnected in various ways, inductively, deductively, and maybe explanatorily. Like, I think this is one, at least a useful term, or at least a useful way to think about this, is like there are extremely, perhaps, complex explanatory interconnections between whole swaths of one's belief system. And the better those hang together, the fewer contradictions or tensions that are generated, the fewer alternate explanations for the same thing that are incompatible with each other, for example, the more justified the belief system is as a whole, and hence the more justified each belief within that system is. Now, Bonjour and Williams, to some extent following Bonjour, does a very good job of dealing with some of the sort of famous or even obvious objections to coherence theory. For example, the idea that there could be alternative, totally incompatible, equally coherent systems of belief. All right. So maybe this isn't true, but it could be true, I guess. Maybe the Star Wars universe is as coherent as our universe, or the universe we purport to share, or think we share, or something like that. Maybe in some ways the Star Wars universe is more coherent than say, empirical science. It wouldn't be that surprising if it were, because Star Wars is basically the imaginative production of a single person almost, and you can imagine whatever you like. Although often human imagination is quite incoherent, and probably that's true of Star Wars. But never mind. So you see what I mean? Like, what distinguishes a fictional coherent system from a factual coherent system, for instance? Couldn't a fictional system be as coherent as a factual system? Okay, so one thing that is messing around with, though, it's not clear in that case whether we're dealing with the coherence theory of justification or the coherence theory of truth. And if you have a coherence theory of truth, I think you really do face a question of why Star Wars isn't true. But if you have a coherence theory of justification, you don't face that problem, at least in that bald way, perhaps. So Bonjour, I mean, one thing we're going to talk about, and this is connected to pragmatism as well, for example, is a coherence theory is often emphasizes the dynamic aspects of knowledge. Like, it's a rolling system, right? Like, I've got to get through my day here, all right? And I'm generating all kinds of new beliefs all the time as I do get through my day. Like, it's raining right now at 10:01 on March 28th, 2020. Okay, I never had that belief before. Okay, now, so the coherence of my belief system has to persist through a whole series of new experiences, even if we're just talking about my personal sense experiences or something like that. Like, it's a dynamic system that's constantly changing. I'm trying to integrate today's news, okay, into my system of belief. I'm not going to be able to do that if I believe I'm living in the Star Wars universe. If I believe that, about 80 billion incompatibilities are going to arise today with my belief system, and it's going to fall apart. It will have fallen apart massively over and over again. Bonjour. One thing Bonjour uses almost analogously to foundational beliefs is spontaneous beliefs. Beliefs that we form involuntarily, continually, all the time. And those, he says, have a special status within a justificatory framework or system. So that performs a variety of like empirical input, or apparently empirical input, or quasi-empirical input, or something analogous to real world input into the belief system, into my belief system, which is dynamic and changing. I'm adding spontaneous beliefs to it all the time. All right. And they have a special status. They come to me involuntarily. They're quasi-incorrigible, we might say, or something like this. At least I can't avoid them. and my rolling belief system has to make sense of them, has to be in a good explanatory relation with them. So, I mean, in short, and I'll let you look at this chapter in the next one, if you start taking some care with the coherence theory, you can make it appear much more plausible than you might have thought that it was, I guess. I don't know how, if you thought it, what you might have thought about it. But you can, and Bonjour does this very interestingly, and Williams does as well. Like, you can develop a much more plausible version of coherence theory than you might think. He does raise the problem is, now, how do we justify specific beliefs? I mean, really, every time you ask me, like, why I think X, I'm going to say, well, the entire global belief system hangs together. Like, okay, so there are certain problems where you want a linear style justification, and it's not clear why you can't, how you can deal with that on this holist view. You probably can, though. All right, but actually, Williams has a fascinating objection to coherence. As far as I know, it's kind of original too, I think, which is that we simply have no... I mean, the discussion is very rich, and I'm going to just abbreviate it, but we actually have no idea what our belief system is. We don't really have even an idea of belief systems, period, like what the conditions for individuation of belief systems, like what would make one belief system distinct from another. Furthermore, we have no idea what our beliefs actually are. We don't exhaustively know what they are, much less how they hang together. And really, Williams beautifully kind of constructs this as a total destruction type of objection very quickly, too. So this is on page 136. The epistemic beliefs implicit in acceptance of the criteria of coherence are not the only locus of epistemic privilege in the coherence theory. To apply these criteria, we need to know what all our beliefs are and how they hang together. In order to know whether I'm justified in believing that P, in virtue of my whole system of beliefs and how it hangs together, I'd have to know what my whole system of beliefs is and how it hangs together. This seems unrealistic. No one has the faintest idea of how many beliefs he has, or even how to go about counting them. This isn't just because we have so many beliefs that we wouldn't know where to begin, though this is perfectly true. Rather, we lack clear criteria for individuating beliefs. That is, saying when beliefs are the same and different, without which there is no possibility of counting. Asking how many beliefs I have is like asking how many drops of water there are in that bucket. Who's to say? I believe that my dog is in the garden right now. Do I also believe that he is not in the house, and not in the basement, not in Siberia, not on Mars, not in another dimension, not flying through a wormhole of space-time? Lord knows. But anyway, so if we can't know what our belief system is, and we can't know how well it hangs together, and these are like the contemporary style objections to introspection as a perfectly transparent source of knowledge or something like this. But if I can't know what my belief system is, then I can't know on this version of coherence whether any of my beliefs are justified. Okay. Maybe they could be justified, though, even so. But maybe we'll have to take that up another time, or not at all. All right, so let's try to meet again next Friday and maybe discuss GE more.